The trap unfolds, a storm approaches. After James speaks with his mother and confirms that John may be involved in the rising cost of wood and disruption in the supply chain, he sets up a private meeting with John. James wants to confront him directly, not just about the business sabotage, but also the deeper reason John's grudge against James's father. Meanwhile, Dipe, unaware of the dangerous games unfolding, continues to live peacefully in the countryside, helping with chores and slowly gaining trust in the local community. However, trouble looms. A mysterious man appears in the village posing as a traveler, but in reality, he's working for John. His mission: to monitor Dipe and possibly use her as leverage against James. James starts digging into the past. He secretly visits an old friend of his father and learns that years ago, during a business expansion, James's father may have unfairly acquired land that once belonged to John's family. This confirms John's motive for revenge. Knowing Dipe is in danger, James decides to secretly move her to a safer location. But before he can act, Dipe receives a call from someone pretending to be James's assistant, asking her to come to the city immediately. It's a trap. As Dipe prepares to leave, the man in the village sends a signal to John. Target is moving. The battle between power, past sins, and love is about to intensify. The sun had just risen over the quiet village, casting golden streaks over the banana trees behind Dipe's house. She had just finished feeding the chickens when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and familiar. "Miss Dipe, this is Toon, James's assistant. James asked me to bring you to the city. There's an urgent matter, and he needs you by his side." Though surprised, Dipe didn't hesitate. She trusted James. After all they had been through, her heart had no room for doubt. "I'll get ready," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Tell him I'll see him soon." What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Toon had never made the call. The man who did now stood just a few feet away, watching from behind a tree, a phone in hand, and a cold smile on his lips. He was the same man who had been pretending to play the guitar in town a few days ago, the same man who had followed her since the day she gave him food out of kindness. Back in the city, James was racing against time. His instinct screamed that something wasn't right. He had tried to call Dipe, but her line was busy. Then, Toon walked in with a pale face and trembling hands. "James," Toon said urgently, "someone just used my name to call Dipe. I never contacted her." James's blood ran cold. "She's in danger," he whispered, already grabbing his car keys. The road to the countryside blurred as he drove faster than he ever had. His mind was on fire. John had made his move, and this time, he was using the person James cared about most. Meanwhile, Dipe boarded a van that was waiting just outside the village, just like the voice on the phone had said. The driver wore dark glasses and didn't say a word. Dipe held tightly to her bag, something inside her chest beginning to feel uneasy. The trees passed by in a blur, but her thoughts kept returning to James. Why didn't he call himself? Halfway down the highway, she finally asked, "Where's James?" "He said he would meet me at the city entrance." The driver didn't respond. He just looked at her through the mirror, cold, silent. And in that moment, Dipe realized something was terribly wrong. Back at the village, the old woman who sold herbs at the corner remembered seeing Dipe get into the van. She saw the man, the way he looked. She didn't trust it. So she called the only number Dipe ever asked her to keep, James's. "Sir, I don't know what's happening," she said in a shaking voice. "But Dipe just left with a strange man. He said he was your assistant. I don't believe him." James's hands clenched around the steering wheel. He was close now, very close. And in the van, Dipe slowly reached for the emergency knife James had once given her, just in case. He had said with a wink. Now, the case had arrived. The battle was no longer about business. It was about survival. It was about love, and it was just beginning. The van rolled silently down a stretch of empty highway. flanked by endless rice fields shimmering under the morning light. Dipe's fingers wrapped tightly around the small emergency knife. James had once handed her. "Keep this, just in case I'm not there when trouble finds you," he had said, half joking, but there had been a seriousness in his eyes she hadn't understood until now. The man driving hadn't said a word since she questioned him. That silence was louder than a scream. Suddenly, the van slowed and turned off the main road onto a narrow, wooded path. Trees loomed overhead, blocking the sunlight. Dipe's heart began to pound. She leaned forward. "I thought we were going to the city." No answer. She swallowed. "Where's James?" Still nothing. The driver just kept his eyes on the road, a smirk creeping onto his lips. She knew then. She wasn't going to the city. Meanwhile, James was tearing down the same highway in his black SUV, dust clouds rising behind him. His phone buzzed. "Toon." He answered instantly. "We traced the call," Toon said breathlessly. "It came from an unregistered phone purchased yesterday. Rural area. Probably a burner. This was planned." James cursed under his breath. His voice dropped to a near growl. "Get the police ready. I'm going in first." Back in the van, Dipe carefully slid her hand into her pocket. The blade was cold, steady. She glanced at the locked doors, the small window beside her. Could she jump just then? The van screeched to a stop. The man turned around. His face was young, too young for the darkness in his eyes. He had a gun tucked into his belt. "Run, now!" She lunged for the door, kicked it open, and leapt into the brush. She didn't look back. Branches tore at her arms, thorns scratched her legs, but she kept going. Her breath was ragged. Tears stung her eyes, but her grip on the knife never loosened. Behind her, she heard the man yell, feet crashing through the undergrowth. And then, a roar, a familiar engine. James's SUV burst through the narrow path like a beast unleashed. He slammed the brakes and jumped out. "Dipe," she ran toward him, collapsing into his arms. But there was no time to breathe. Gunfire cracked through the trees. James grabbed her, shielding her body as they dove behind the SUV. "Stay down," he growled, pulling a small pistol from under the driver's seat. "You brought a gun," she gasped. "I came to get you back," he said, "whatever it takes." The kidnapper emerged from the forest, shouting into a phone. "She's with him. He found us." James stepped out slowly, weapon ready. "Tell John this ends now, no more games." But the man only raised his gun. A single shot rang out, and everything went still. For a moment, the forest held its breath. A bird took flight from a nearby tree. The scent of gunpowder lingered faintly in the air. Dipe's hands clutched the earth beneath her, eyes squeezed shut, then a groan. James stepped forward, still pointing the gun, but the man in front of him was already on his knees, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. "I told you," James said, voice steady but deadly calm. "This ends now." He kicked the man's weapon aside and yanked the phone from his pocket. One glance at the screen confirmed it, a call from Jay. James didn't answer. He tossed the phone onto the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. Behind him, Dipe stumbled up from behind the SUV, her face pale, but eyes burning with adrenaline. James ran to her and held her tight, his chest rising and falling with every breath he had feared he might never take again. "You're safe now," he whispered, but she shook her head. "No, this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Meanwhile, at a luxury penthouse in the city, John stood by the glass window, swirling a glass of red wine, watching the skyline without really seeing it. His phone had gone silent. He'd been watching the whole operation unfold through security footage hacked from nearby traffic cameras. His man had failed. Worse, James had come personally. John smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "So you're willing to get your hands dirty now?" "James," he murmured, "then let's see how far you're willing to go." He turned to the figure waiting behind him, a tall man in a gray suit, face half hidden in shadow. activate the next phase, John said. Let's destroy everything he has left. James and Dipe sat in a quiet hospital room. Her wounds were minor scratches and bruises, but she was exhausted. James sat beside her bed, hand wrapped around hers. I should have told you everything sooner, he said, voice low, about John, about the company, about the land my father took from his family. Dipe looked at him, tired but unwavering. Secrets destroy people more than enemies do. James looked away, guilt tightening in his chest. I won't keep any more secrets, he promised. But I need you to know something. She tilted her head slightly. They're going after the company again. John's pulling every string. The foreign investors, the agricultural imports, the dam project, everything is compromised. Dipe sat up straighter. Then we fight. James looked at her in surprise. You're not afraid. I am, she admitted. But love isn't just about holding hands when things are easy. It's about choosing each other when the world falls apart. Somewhere else in the city, a stranger stood watching a factory burn from across a river. Flames lit up his face, and the guitar case on his back looked oddly out of place. He took a slow drag from his cigarette and smiled. T. Dipe, we meet again soon, he muttered. Then he turned and vanished into the night. In the face of betrayal, chaos, and danger, true strength is not found in how loudly we fight, but in how deeply we love and how fiercely we protect those who matter. Love is not just about romance. It's about loyalty, trust, and the courage to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. James and Dipe's journey reminds us that when the storms of life come crashing down, we have two choices: to run or to hold each other tighter. Real love doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. It shows up in the darkest hours when the heart is tested and still chooses to stay. And as for our enemies, sometimes the greatest revenge is not retaliation, but rising again, stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. Every setback is a setup for a comeback if we choose to rise instead of break. James lost his company, faced betrayal, and even stared down the possibility of prison. Yet he did not let bitterness consume him. Instead, he turned pain into purpose. Forgiveness, even in the face of deep wounds, is not weakness, it's wisdom. James could have sought revenge recklessly, but he chose to be strategic, calm, and protective of those he loved. In doing so, he gained something far more powerful than victory. He gained clarity, integrity, and self-mastery. And Dipe? She stood as a quiet force of resilience. Her presence was her power. Her faith in James, even when everything seemed lost, proved that love built on honesty and respect can weather any storm. In life, people may try to destroy what you've built. Some will envy your success, others will fear your light. But what matters most is not what they do to you, it's what you do next. So build wisely, love deeply, and when the world pushes you to your knees, use that moment to pray, then rise.